Hello, the goal of today's video is to show you how to troubleshoot the MAM SDK using the micro VPN with the endpoint management service. So what we're doing here is we're logging into the endpoint management console. And the landing page here is just a dashboard. And one of the first things we want to do is go into settings. And then we're going to go to Ldap. And we want to make sure that we have an Ldap server here so that authentication and enrollment functions fine. And the main thing we're looking at here is just the use search by option here. So you'll have an option of user principal name or SAM account name. So if you choose user principal name here, which is what we're doing, then our gateway needs to use user principal name for authentication as well. So now the next thing we want to do is go into apps. And we want to look at our Mdx Policy Configuration for our app. In our case, it's a simple browser. And we're going to just go ahead and edit this. And we're working on an iOS device. And one of the first things we want to do is look at the network access here. And by default, this will be set to blocked. And so you want to make sure this is turned on to tunneled web SSO. That tells the application that its policy is to use the micro VPN. The other is to turn off app passcode if you don't have that compliance implemented, because if app passcode or device passcode are turned on, then you will get a compliance error. So it's just easier to just turn those off. The other thing is for non-compliant behavior, we want to set this to allow app after warning. For our development, we would generally turn this on. We would typically not allow the app to continue to function in production, but for development purposes, it's nice to have this so you can at least get over that hurdle if there is some sort of compliance problem. The other value we want to look at is the max offline period. And by default, this is set to 7 days. So if someone in your environment has set this value very low, to say maybe an hour, what happens is this is not activity-based. So at an hour, the app will stop functioning and we'll have to connect back to the server. So it's easier to just set that to a value and know what it is. The other thing here is the delivery group, right? You want to make sure you have the user's device assigned to a delivery group, because if you use it, say something like Xcode, and you try and connect, and run your app, if it checks up and then the policy isn't assigned to the app, then it won't function and it won't try to use the VPN. So it's a good place to start to just make sure you have those things configured. The next thing we want to do is go into the Citrix Gateway. And here inside the gateway, we want to check this URL and make sure we know what it is, that it resolves, and that we can connect to it, right? So a common thing we'll do here is just connect in and copy this URL, right? And then paste it into our browser somewhere and just make sure that it connects and that we see the gateway. We're going to open up a new tab here and just paste that URL into our browser and make sure we get the default gateway login page. So assuming we get that, we can continue on down the road. If that page doesn't load, we could potentially have a DNS or a firewall issue or something to that effect, or a misconfiguration on the NetScaler. So now another option is, let's just make sure DNS is working not only for the endpoint management service, but also let's make sure that works for the MAM gateway as well. So what we're doing here is just we copy the URL, just make sure there's no typos, and we're just going to do a dig command here. I'm on a Mac, but if you're on a Windows computer, and NSLOOKUP would work as well. So as you can see here, our IP address came up. So let's go ahead and clear the screen here on our shell. And let's go ahead and put in our gateway address as well. So a nice little way to do this is just dig and then your MAM gateway FQDN. In my case, it's ag.bolins.com. Okay, and I'm on a lab network, so this is a private IP. Obviously, if you were from the outside, you'd want to make sure that works as well. So it's public IP, and if you're NATing through your firewall to the gateway, then you would obviously use the NATed address as well. So let's switch over to our NetScaler web interface, and notice we're using the management IP's address of .1.72 instead of .74, which is the gateway interface. And let's go into System and Licenses. Let's just make sure. So if you look at the model ID, this is essentially the throughput that the network will support. So if you see a 1 there, odds are your license is just the default license is not going to be enough. We want to make sure we have Citrix Gateway user licenses to meet our testing environment. So if that's 0, then obviously you need to have some licensing issues. Another thing you can do here is under network, you can go in and look at the IPs. And so you can see here there's a NetScaler IP, a virtual IP, and subnet IP. And so the NetScaler IP is the management interface, the subnet IP is the outbound traffic, So if you watched our video, you should recognize this slide, right? And this is where the MAM traffic for DNS will resolve to a public IP and hit the Netscaler gateway. An important thing to note here is that if you recall from that discussion, that the Netscaler terminates the SSL session. So if we can get our authentication into the gateway and make that succeed, the other thing we need to do is make sure that the SNP can get where it needs to go. So it has to be able to get out to the cloud service on port 8443. But the other thing it needs to do is it needs to be able to connect to the inbound application. So if your internal application, say, is a website or a web service, that SNP IP is the IP address will be accessing your application. So you need to make sure that that connectivity works. So if it can't get there, then obviously your application is not going to function properly. The other thing is that the management IP, that management IP has to be able to be accessible for your workstation to log into the console, but it also has to be able to get outbound access so it can talk to Active Directory to authenticate the end user. So you need to make sure that that's functional as well. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that our Ssl certificate is valid. And so a nice little tool is digicert.com/help has a little utility that you can enter your DNS name, your FQDN, and it will check the certificate and make sure that the chain is valid. So as you can see here, I've got my full certificate chain loaded and linked in my Netscaler. So if there were a problem where the certificates weren't linked properly, then you could have, your certificate wouldn't be trusted. So the next thing we want to do is get into our virtual server on the gateway and just get the certificate name that we're using. So if we had a problem where it wasn't linked or wasn't showing the full chain in the utilities, we can then get the certificate name here off the gateway and then go into our Ssl certificates and then server certificates. And what we can do is we can check our cert here, and there's an option. You can do it from the drop-down menu. I'm going to do it in the video here from the link button to the right. And we should see all of our certificates linked. So if all the certificates in your chain aren't linked here, then you would have to go in and actually make sure they're on the Netscaler and link them. So now that we're on our Netscaler, what we want to do is go in and look at traffic management and look at our load balancer and make sure this is functional. This can cause typically problems with enrollment, not so much with your apps, but it's a good thing to do is just come in and check that the service group here is set up properly. So if you were to see the state is down, one of the two things that can cause is either DNS is not functioning properly or the firewall is blocking the outbound traffic. So if that IP address is 000, either DNS is not working right or you have a problem with your outbound firewall rules. So the next thing we want to do is same thing in the server certificate, our wildcard certificate in my case, right, that you saw in the gateway earlier, needs to be configured here as well. So obviously we've checked that those are good and matched and linked and everything. It's important you have those ready. And the next thing we want to do is go into DNS, and obviously DNS needs to be functional. So if the DNS server is not effective state is not enabled or up and its state is not enabled, then you're going to have name resolution problems. The other thing is DNS suffixes. Now this won't impact you so much for iOS devices, but if all your internal DNS suffixes are not defined here, you can have problems on Android as well. So obviously you need to populate all those with your environment as they pertain to you. So then address records here, it's good to make sure that any DNS related records or records that may not be in DNS that need to be resolved are here. In my case, for this testing, you notice you don't see the autopro.xm.cloud.com here. That's removed for some basic testing, which is a nice thing you can do if you're having trouble with enrollment not working. You can just kind of bypass that. The others, we're now gone into the gateway, and we want to make sure that the state is up. So if it's not up, then typically you have a problem with your certificate. If the IP address is good and you have an Ssl certificate on it, the gateway should be up and present itself to a client. So if you're having a problem there, generally I've got my certificate applied here. So a lot of times what happens is people fat finger the certificate name when they're running the setup script, and then it's not here. So obviously check to make sure that's there. We then want to go into the Ldap policies and make sure this is connecting and functioning properly. Now, we've done some testing to make sure they're good, right? But in general, if you're having some problems, this is one of the first places you want to come. And so we're going to select Edit Server here. And if you scroll down under the attributes here, you notice user principal name is defined here, which is what we said in the endpoint management console. So if I had set that to SAM account name and was trying to use a SAM account name here, obviously it's going to fail. There is a test network connectivity here, so you can run that and it'll just validate from your desktop where the browser is running. It will validate, can it connect, right? It's not testing from the gateway, or from the Netscaler, it's testing from your desktop, but at least you can validate that you have proper IP address, host name, and credentials. So now what we're going to do is get on our shell. And I'm on a Mac, so SSH is built in. If you're on Windows, you could use PuTTY or something to that effect, right? But ultimately what we want to do is get on our Netscaler, get to the shell, and what we're going to do is cat the tmp/AAAD.debug. And what this will do is show us LDAP authentication traffic as it goes. So what we can do is open up another tab here, and if we connect to our gateway, and it should present us a login page, and I'm just going to do a login here and type the wrong password, and the idea being that to show you what the failure responses are here, right? So let's go back to our window, and what you'll see here is a lot of text about the communication with Active Directory, but the main thing here at the bottom is this rejecting, right? That tells us that we were connect to Active Directory and we tried to log in, but it said, hey, these are invalid credentials. So now let's go back and show you what it looks like when you do it properly. So let's type my username and put in my valid password. And notice it says, hey, it's trying to do a gateway logon. It sees that I'm not on a mobile device, so obviously this isn't going to succeed. But if we go back, you notice at the bottom here, we see sending accept. So that means we got through. So if we were testing with our device and we see this come in, and it succeeds, but then it can't connect, we know, hey, we authenticated the gateway fine. We have typically a back-end communication problem, right? So that gateway login timed out here, so we'll probably won't see the entries here, but what we'd like to do is just show you where you can go to see, is there an active session? So if I choose all users here and click show, right, if I had a live session here, you would see it. So typically if you have your app functioning and it gets into the gateway, you will see that, and especially for things like Secure Hub, you can see 4, 5, or 6 sessions for a given Secure Hub connection. So you need to make sure before you start your testing, you know what is there. That way you can see when your app comes in, did that number of sessions increase, or did it drop, or did it stay the same? Okay, so now what we want to do is try and trace some traffic. So let's give a scenario where a client's trying to connect to the gateway, you launch your app, but you don't see anything happening, a connection's failing. So one of the first things we do is use a little utility called Nstcp Dump, and you can do host and put an IP address, and that can be source or destination, or you can do port and whatever specific port. So if there's a specific port that your app connects on, it makes it really easy to filter that traffic. What we're going to do here is just do a host and then the IP address of our gateway, right? And so you notice here we see a little bit of traffic. This is kind of a little internet traffic hitting the gateway. But in general, there's nothing really happening here, right? So if we run our app and we see no traffic, no IP connections hitting, or nothing from our client IP, then hey, that's a potential problem, right? So what I'm going to do is just simulate some client traffic and do a curl command here hitting the gateway, right? And what you'll see here is when we run this command, there's a little bit of output here. We can see some SSL stuff works, but you notice on the left-hand side is the source IP and destination is on the right. So as you look, there's a 192.168.74, and then there's a 72 to 1.70 to 74, and vice versa. So they're flip-flopping back and forth. And you notice the flags on the right are the SYN, the ACKs, the FINs, etc. Right? So you can see here that we saw traffic coming and going from our port. Right? So that's a telltale sign that, hey, we've got communication going here. So if we see that happening and LDAP is working, then we generally know we're in good shape and we're connecting. Now, the flip side of that is if we're trying to do something where, hey, it looks like we're already getting to the gateway, now we need to know, is the traffic getting to our backend server? So in this case, we're going to filter for something to port with IP.88, right? And the idea here is that we just want to simulate some traffic and show you kind of what it would look like, right? So this is an IP that doesn't have a server that would respond to it at the moment, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put that curl command here, and it's trying to make a connection. So what you see here is we see traffic going from the .72 IP out to the .88, but we never see the .88 come back. That's a telltale sign that we probably have some sort of firewall issue or routing issue or something to that effect, right? So that helps us identify is traffic leaving and is hat traffic coming back without having to do something with Wireshark. So an important thing to note here when we're doing this and we're doing things on the shell is that traffic when you log in via the Netscaler via SSH and you're on the shell, that traffic does not leave out of the SNP. That traffic leaves out of the management interface. So if you're testing something like connectivity to, say, Ldap, then that test would be valid. But if you're trying to validate can the SNP get out, then you really need to test that from a device passing through the gateway and going out. Or if you have a load balancer set up for like the MAM load balancing interface, then that traffic would hit the load balancer and leave the SNP. But that's a common problem that you need to be aware of because it can give you a false sense of security or a false sense that, hey, there's a problem. So certainly keep that in mind when you're doing your testing. So another important aspect here is some show commands. And so if you type exit here, it'll get back to the CLI, which is indicated by the greater than sign, which is opposed to being on the shell, which is actually being at the base operating system. So one of the things we can do is there are some show commands that are quite helpful for us. And so one of the first ones is show IP, and you can obviously get this stuff from the web interface, but this will, if you're on the shell doing testing, it's nice to be able to get and see what's the management interface IP, what are the SNP and the VIPs, etc. Right, so you can see if they're enabled and their state as well. Now the other thing that can be helpful is, hey, if we've shown that there's not a firewall problem, maybe we've got a routing problem, and so that's where we can get in and see our default route is going to the 192.168.1.254. So if you've got multiple networks or interfaces and IPs and SNPs on your Netscaler, it would be good to understand what those routes are. So now let's look at things from the app perspective. You can see here we have the SDK installed, we have the micro VPN delegate, and everything integrated into our application. We have containment done here as well, but not really relevant for this discussion. And inside of this app, it just is a simple embedded browser to access the site. So obviously you would need to adjust that. You can see we've tested the app on this iPad that we have here, and Secure Hub is installed on the right-hand side as well there. So we also have our gateway ready, so we can go in and look at active sessions. Did it actually log in? Did it get there, right? So let's go back and actually run the app here. So note that there's a bunch of logging here. We'll come back to that in a moment and show you how to test it, but I just had a breakpoint set here in the app so I could kind of walk through here. And if you look on the right, there's a compliance warning there, but hey, we basically accessed a simple internal IIS website inside of my network, and just clicked on a link in that, and it took me to the basic IIS page. So we know that that app is going through the tunnel, it can read everything and can get back. And then if we go back and look at active user sessions, it's good to switch to active users here. And you see there's a number of sessions for my device. There weren't any there before I started. And so you can click end here and terminate all sessions. If you want to start clean for just one user on an existing Netscaler that has a bunch of people, that's possible. So now let's look at the logs inside of our application. You can see scrolling back here, there is a lot of logging information that comes out of his, and a lot of swizzling classes, etc. But one of the main things we can do is search for NSURL here. And this is the kind of the main stuff we want to see. We want to see the swizzling class, NSURL authentication, configuration, NS connection, and session show the main things about the app that we want to see. You notice there's some warnings that come up here, but we saw our application function. So some of these are just warnings that we can ignore. The other thing to do here is search for your site name. In my case is AutoPro, so we don't see any warnings there. So there may be a situation where you had trouble, say, downloading the policy information. So you might want to search for that if you saw that kind of error.